Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Miss Education Podcast. We are here doing part 2 with Jaiman on teaching practice and careers and beyond. I know that the title, I'll just say this, I know the title sounds a bit practical and a bit static, but I promise you, if you listen to part 1, you're here for part 2. It's a very philosophical, abstract conversation. You know, if you're into grounding techniques, if you're into thinking about how you can change the world, this is the podcast for you. So in part 1, we talked about the different types of teaching practices, where we've taught, how it's affected us, what are the implications of teaching in different areas, and what have we learned about ourselves and others as teachers. In part 2, we're kind of going more into where are we now? We aren't teachers, but we're still teachers. And what does that mean? And so I wanted to talk about the content of what we both have taught in the past and how it's led us to where we are today. So in part 1, Jaiman talked about his music education in university and how he became a music teacher, but he also spoke about how music kind of morphed into social skills. In part 1, he mentioned how the students, he had to kind of teach them, hey, you're in a group. You have to work together. You have to compromise. You're going to have to maybe let go of what you wanted to do, because if you're in a band, you can't just have it your way. It's several people involved. And so I want to ask you, Jaiman, the content of what you taught, how has it evolved over the years, and how has it brought you to where you are today, from music educator to consultant?
So I think what might help is me describing the content and maybe the context in which I was teaching that content a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
So as I said, then you did a great job kind of reflecting it back. Was when I started in India, I was teaching pretty much just music as well as social skill building, and you did a really good job of describing kind of some of the main things I was teaching around that. And I would say that I was doing that for about 2 years. In the second year, the first year I taught students from particularly, I guess, as I said before, below the poverty threshold in Delhi, New Delhi. The second year I taught at this beautiful school called Shanti Bhavan. And the context there is that the school only accepts students who are from Dalit backgrounds. So for people who don't know, that in India there's a historical caste system. And my lineage comes from the quote-unquote top of the caste system, which is Brahmin identity. The students from that school are from Dalit backgrounds, which means they're from they use this term called untouchable, but that has actually been a thing in Indian societies. It's relegated to labor work that essentially carries the stigma of being untouchable because they're doing that kind of work, but it's not only limited to that work. And basically that was the context I was teaching in, but the students have been there since preschool. So in many ways, many of those projections they have faced more when they come home from summer vacation, or even in the school itself, just being like, you can help undo this kind of thing in our society. So it's a little bit different. There I began to sort of use the experiences of my students and learn from them and see a little bit around how does this go into a little bit around what's causing this to begin in the first place. So through music, it was a really beautiful bridge into the history sometimes of caste with some classes. For other classes, it was a little bit around what are some of the freedom movements in India that you're really inspired by? And music may seem so separate from that, and in many ways it is, but also music for me began to slowly be a way of sort of building trust and getting a buy-in to come to this class and feel safe in this class. And then through that, I would find ways to weave in this into the conversations around being a better singer, around music fundamentals, etc. I think when I came back to the US, and particularly when I worked in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, that's when my music curriculum kind of began to change a little bit more towards arts and activism in general. So it went a little bit from examining history and examining these, everything I was kind of saying before, into examining a little bit of what it means to community organize and to collaborate around building a campaign message. And the context there were like heavily segregated historical societies that, come into schools that are extremely under-resourced. They have to walk through a metal detector every time they come in. The police are patrolling the corridors, often have to deal with outbursts violently rather than restoratively. So in those contexts, we began to use music and the sort of skills around collaboration, around self-expression, around, creating a certain message in music. And that began to sort of relate a little bit towards campaign building around a particular thing you wanted to change. Yeah. So like in one of the classrooms I did was like, we wanted to change the lunch conditions in the school. So like, how do we reallocate money from, this heavily kind of militarized school culture towards just getting better food, Yeah. And it was beautiful. I mean, the kids together kind of through their learning of music collaboratively and around, as you were saying, that sort of compromise versus, I really want to push this this particular agenda. We created this beautiful, kind of campaign that like we gained some community like support around, and we brought to the principal, and it was really beautiful in that way. So I think again, it kind of evolved from music and just like the beautiful things that can come out of music towards what does music a bridge into in terms of activism and community building. I myself began to kind of like grow more into community organizing work after that, particularly around police accountability. And I would say like all of those roots came from my arts activism classroom. Right. But I will also say some classrooms were just like that safe and escape space. It wasn't often, some classrooms like just had no agenda other than like, let's be here and like, you want to freestyle for a bit? Let's do that. You seem like you like drumming. Let's work with that. And cool, everyone's doing these different things. Let's just put it together. So I've chose to respond to the needs, or what I anticipated the needs were of the different classrooms I worked in. Because as a music educator, you're not just teaching one classroom, you're teaching all of the classrooms, all the different sections, all the students. So.
Yeah. Wow. And then in terms of you're now working in leadership development, right? And do you feel like, especially because we met at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, most people go into these programs to do a career change. That's kind of how they market the degree. Did you feel like you were ready to leave teaching permanently, classroom teaching? We'll clarify. Are you ready to leave classroom teaching entering Harvard? Is that why you moved out of the classroom space into a graduate degree and maybe looked for that kind of leadership development?
I don't think I was really ready, but I think in the sense of like when I was actually there at, we call it HUGSE, right? Harvard Graduate School of Education. Yeah. Because I really found that I missed it. And even now I find that a lot, but I can just say fully with my chest that a big reason for me coming to HUGSE was I was burnt out as more than I could have even realized at the time. Yeah. Because alongside the really beautiful, strong moments of learning and those moments where students were it was rich. Some of those moments in the classroom to see them build this campaign or, open up when they have been so closed off emotionally. Yeah. Alongside that was sometimes very violent places. I sometimes weekly, several times a week, I had to break up fights for pretty strong kids, Right. And sometimes it was just play fighting, but most of the time it's also real fighting. Yeah. And I had to the school culture was often around, if you're not yelling, if you're not being hard on the kids, then they're not going to respond, Yeah. So my voice physically hurt days after school because I had to find this medium that wasn't yelling, but I had to learn how to project. And there's people who are vocalists, even people you who do podcasts. There's a difference. We know that we can project fully, but yelling is different. And I don't know, I had to learn all these things I never thought I had to. And it burned me out so much.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I think I did have to like get away from it for a bit, but now it's like I miss it a lot. Even though I'm really really loving the work I'm doing right now and I'm finding it really meaningful, I miss it. In adult education, you don't get as much of the curiosity of youth. You have to break through adults a lot more to get them to be real. Whereas, at least I found with youth, you know,
they'll be real.
They'll be real. That's
and when you don't ask for it.
Yeah, right. Love it.
Which is the best part.
Right.
Yeah, I think as adults, we constantly put on masks because that's just how we survive.
Right.
And we don't want to be looked at as weird. We don't want to be looked at as abnormal, but we're all kind of abnormal and we just hide that about ourselves. And
so true.
Yeah, it's not, I don't know if it's helpful or if it's productive or if we would all just be kind of running around the street if we were just being ourselves, but
yeah,
most people don't act in their truest form at work. That's like not the place as adults. That's not the place that you would be yourself. I feel like that kind of content, teaching content growth, I feel it's quite similar for me as well. My teachables are history and social sciences, although I never taught social sciences. I actually never taught history. I didn't.
You just mentioned you actually didn't do.
I didn't even go to school. I did history in a placement, and I was a student teacher. I taught history, but then I also did my qualification for English second language learning. So I did more of that. I did a lot of ESL in Canada, and then I went abroad. I went to Vietnam. I taught ESL as well. And then when I was in Italy, I did a TEFL through theater and play. So I was kind of doing a lot of different things with English language learning. And in Vietnam, I had so many different subjects I was teaching. I did ESL, and then I did home economics, and then I did UN sustainability, and then I did drama. Like I was helping run a musical production. And then I did English literature. And especially when I did English literature, mostly because the students I was doing English literature with were higher in English, we kind of transitioned, or at least I said we are all now transitioning to social justice, because a lot of English literature, you can respond to social issues in literature, in fiction, in nonfiction. We mostly actually read fiction, right? And at least I wasn't in the past a huge fiction reader. And I almost thought fiction was like, you're in the clouds, but actually fiction can teach us almost more about the world than nonfiction. I feel like the world of fiction is so deep and it's unbelievable. So as a class, we were reading The Great Gatsby because it's the only class text I have. It's like the grade 11 novel. We read it in Canada. It's available at the Canadian private school I was teaching at in Vietnam. But I was like, we are not doing the typical assignments. We're not doing the typical, what people are doing here. One of my friends, Christina, who's an amazing teacher, she created this resource where you're basically doing The Great Gatsby, but you are critically analyzing the themes, and then you're relating it back to yourself, and then relating it to the world. And so my students were deep in The Great Gatsby. They were doing, how is Great Gatsby similar to white supremacy? And what other themes in the world can I pull from this? And one of my students said, well, Great Gatsby has white supremacy because some of the characters, such as Tom in the book, he's always reading and holding this book about how white people are like the greatest race. He's written that book in the book. And then in the book, it kind of mentions some servants who might be Black in the background, no character development. And then they related this to anti-Asian hate in the US, the rising hate crimes. And they said that's based in white supremacy. And so there's actually an overlap between The Great Gatsby and the culture in the US right now. And this was in 2020, right? In 2021. And I was like, oh, exactly. That's why we're reading The Great Gatsby. You know what I mean? And it's not that we're doing Great Gatsby just to say, oh, this is what white people did in the 1920s. They did their dances and whatever. Like, sure, we can learn about the culture of that time, but at the same time, there's themes, right? Like, there's things going on in the book that aren't just about, 1920s boom, like the economic boom. And some students said the perception versus reality. Gatsby's portraying himself to be a certain kind of person. but there's a different reality. And my students related it to Instagram. They said this is perception versus reality. They have those pictures on Instagram. They have how do you pose when you know it's going to be on Instagram versus when you know it's, just for the memories. And so they kind of took these themes of Great Gatsby where we were able to relate it to ourselves, to social justice, to that kind of teaching practice. And even as a teacher, I was like, clearly they love culturally relevant content. It's Great Gatsby could not be further from their culture, right? Like it's so irrelevant to Vietnamese students, teenagers, but creating content that was, and that is like DEI, right? Like that's the equity part where I'm like, oh, I'm going to do culturally relevant content and I'm going to create something new and I'm going to create something that they feel excited to consume or have some connection to. And it's still high quality English literature. It's still analytical. It's still original. You can't plagiarize that. What are you going to type into GPT? It's not a question, it's like, this is all in your mind. Right. And so I was really able to kind of get them the wheels turning with them. And it was really exciting. But even when I was doing that kind of teaching, then I would think more about the systems and processes. And I was thinking, how can, teachers be more prepared to do things like this and actually respond to text? What does it mean for all teachers to be anti-racist? What does it mean to have school boards that actually respond to equity issues and things like that? That's why I applied for the fellowship that we were in, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Leadership Fellowship, right? Things like that, where I'm like, okay, let's see what happens if I'm done with the classroom. Let's transition into this world of DEI, leadership, policy. Like that was just kind of like my step that came from me teaching ESL, right?
Right. Oh, that's so beautiful because first of all, I didn't know this about you. I feel like I'm learning so much about you through a podcast format, which is cool in itself. I dig. But also, it's like this. It's like what we kind of talked about in part one, right? It's like we think of these things as so divided, but like once we break out of a box, like a box that has been taught of us in order to like separate things and keep them like neatly in their own like little receptacles, that we begin to see actually how interrelated the world is, and that from something like literature you can draw like all these different like viewpoints. But it's really like how you're saying also for teachers, it's like, to what degree are we equipped to think outside the box like that? To what degree? And I would say like, maybe this is just me being an optimist, but I feel that like teachers are uniquely positioned to think like that or think outside the box, or at least be critical of like society, because we are both part of an institution and also are seeing, the extreme effects of a failing institution like education. We're seeing a systemic reality like actually unfolding like in front of us, whether we can see it like that, it's, that's for me, luckily in time, I learned that to see more, like I was seeing racism in front of me, but I began to see it systemically through my learning later, but so like we are in a position that we've experienced quite a bit of like different things. And yet, like maybe we can be in a position to also, realize the power of our position rather than come from like the scarcity mindset of being like, oh, we're teachers, we're helpless, like we're not getting funded and everything. There's just a lot more to like our position as teachers to think creatively and outside the box because of how much we're confronted with.
Right. Yeah. And I think that we don't even give ourselves enough credit as teachers for how many transferable skills we have. I feel like this, it probably is a PSA, but it should be a PSA that we are project managers, we are leaders, we are, doing everything that every other job's doing with 30 kids, and I think people see teaching as, oh, your skill is that you maybe have good communication skills, you can stand in front of the classroom. Like, no, I'm actually managing multiple priorities. I'm speaking to 30 different sets of parents on a weekly, monthly, maybe daily basis. That's client relationships, that's relationship management, that's stakeholder engagement, that's community engagement. Like, it's all of these things that I think people feel like, oh, well, I don't have the skills to transfer to other jobs, right? How can I create the slide deck? We are always creating slide decks as teachers all the time. That's your presentation. That's your lesson plan, right? Like we're literally doing all the things that people, I don't know, see as a deficit, but speaking to that, right? Teaching as leadership, right? Because now you are in a role where you're seen as a leader, right? You said teacher is not the word, but you would say that you are teaching as consulting. Why don't we use the word teacher? What is the difference between someone who is an advisor, a consultant advisor, and someone who's a teacher? Like, what is the real difference? Is it infantilizing to adults to say, "Oh, hi, I'm your teacher. Let's all sit down"?
Such a I almost just want to like ask everyone at my organization and elsewhere, just like, what is it around the fact that we got to use like more multisyllabic words to describe this context when what we're doing is really education,
Yeah.
And I mean, I can only guess fully, but I feel that like, I think it's a question again of like institution, like there's the institution of education, but then there's the act of education, So like by going into a room with a bunch of like government officials that hired us to teach around adaptive leadership, that's not a classroom. That's not the institution of a class,
Right.
Just like the way, but even like the way like a college is, the way that all these other things that are accepted institutionally are. So I think there's a sort of like, again, we're trying to like create more definitions in boxes, and maybe they're practical to do. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just maybe kind of like wondering why we break up these things that actually are, as you're saying, like transferable skills. Like I feel like I'm an educator. I call myself an educator kind of more openly because I really believe what I'm doing is education, even if it means I'm, being hired, to go into a particular space, if it's only for like a week or a couple of days or a day, with adults. Right. So I think my personal thought is like, it is like the way that we differentiate the institutions versus the way that we, the act itself.
Right.
Of teaching, of educating, of learning.
Got it. Yeah. So the institutions may not use the language, but you're saying that effectively you still feel like you're in somewhat of you're in the same career. Maybe the job title is different, the people are different, but it's still a good trajectory of teaching in a way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do you see yourself developing in the future? Do you feel like the consultant role fits you for a lifetime? I mean, teaching, a lot of people don't stay in teaching for their whole lives, right? Especially like you mentioned, burnout, right? Burnout is really common amongst teachers, especially with COVID and post-COVID. But do you feel like consulting has more longevity than teaching did?
It's a great question. And to be honest, I can't say I fully know, because the way that I've always approached my career, which has both served me and has also been a detriment to me, has been more like around what do I really want to learn right now, rather than what are my next steps, So for me, for example, I'm entering this work at my organization currently, with the curiosity of what it means to, like, is there actually a systemic effect, a systemic pushing on systems that we can do by going not as activists that work outside of systems or pressure systems, but as almost, it's a language I think we learned in our fellowship of, like, as an infiltrator, really, to go inside a system that's working and to push on those buttons that help people who have power already to begin to, like, actually think more responsibly around that power. Hence, like, become more of a leader rather than someone who holds authority. There's a distinction between having authority and being a leader.
Yeah.
So, like, for me, that's like what I want to learn right now going in here. I'm getting a lot of answers and I'm turning it upside down. Like maybe it isn't systemic. Maybe it's just making people's lives better, which is important. But if we really want to push systems, but maybe that's also not true.
Right.
So for me, like my question of like staying in consulting is just going to be like how I'm beginning to feel a year from now, maybe a couple of months from now, a few years from now. And in many ways, I find myself also missing things. Like I really miss being around youth. I really miss classrooms. I miss like creating those safe space and having them like a nice safe space like students can go through throughout a year. Like they're just things that aren't present in this work that are just so beautiful and lively in classroom work. And I guess if I had to say there is a way of me maybe seeing something down the line, it would be to do like dip my toes in a lot of it. You know, maybe I am more of like a contractor or like a freelancer where I'm going into different spaces and have like my own curriculum, my own, you know, arts and leadership and DEI, etc. But that's, let's see if the road leads to that. I think it's just very important. At least it works for me. But for others, my advice is like, entering a situation and thinking like, what can I learn here rather than like, what will this lead to? Right.
What can I learn here rather than what can this lead to? Because then you don't have to stress over controlling the outcome. Right. Because we don't know the outcome. So you can just kind of live your life, take the steps and see where it leads you. I love that. Right. I have one final question for you. So, and it's a spicy question.
Okay. I'm Indian, so I love my spices.
So if tomorrow you were offered the same, whatever your salary is, the same salary you have, the same benefits, maybe even the same lifestyle, like hybrid work, you know, whatever your lifestyle is day to day, but you're no longer a consultant. Maybe you're a teacher. Maybe you're a teaching coach. Maybe you do some things online. Maybe you kind of choose whatever you want to do. Would you give it up and change the job tomorrow?
That is a spicy question. I don't know if this would surprise you, but I would say no.
Okay.
Because again, I am learning an intense amount of things right now that if I were to go back to that work, if that scenario were presented to me in 5 years, I just started this year, for example, in this job in the round of leadership development work. Yeah. But I could, in many ways, I would feel even better equipped, and I could come back even stronger or whatever it might be to a situation of like classroom education, if that were the case. But I do believe, and I'm grounded in the fact that I'm in the right place right now. But highly aware of those little questions that come to my head, like missing my students a lot, or like, I don't know, part of me is like this question of like, is the work of leadership development in adults actually systemically impactful? Because I believe that classroom education really can be systemically impactful. It's just building the youth in the future is a way that we can, is one of the critical ways that we can shift systems, even if it's more of like a long run, you know? Right. So I would say no, but also like, maybe ask me again soon. Maybe ask me again in a month or like 5 years or, you know, when I'm 70. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the close of our podcast part 2, where we talked with Jaiman about, you know, honestly, so many more things than I thought, more than the titles lead on. I don't know what the title of this podcast is going to be. Like how to going from musician to consultant. I don't know. But thank you so much for being on this podcast. I really enjoyed this time speaking with you. And thank you everyone for listening. If you're not already subscribed, please subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. I also have the video version on YouTube. So thank you so much. And we will talk to you next time. Thank you, Victoria. Bye.